What if I told you? The American Revolution wasn't fought by brave patriots chasing freedom, but by reluctant colonists pushed into a war they didn't want and didn't believe they could win? We're often taught that the American Revolution was inevitable, a heroic uprising, a nation rising together against tyranny. But history rarely unfolds that cleanly. In the early 1770s, independence was not a popular idea. Most colonists did not dream of a new nation. They were British. They spoke English. They celebrated the king. They traded across the Atlantic. They believed they were part of the greatest empire on earth. And when tensions began to rise between Britain and its American colonies, very few people imagined it would end in revolution. In fact, many of the people who would later become leaders of the rebellion, men like George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, were not originally seeking independence at all. They wanted compromise. They wanted fairness. They wanted to remain British. But history has a way of pushing people toward choices they never planned to make. And sometimes, a revolution begins not with ambition, but with hesitation. The colonies before revolution. To understand how the American Revolution began, we have to start with what life looked like before the conflict. Because the American colonies were not miserable places. In fact, they were thriving. By the mid-1700s, Britain's American colonies were prosperous and growing rapidly. Ports like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston bustled with trade. Farmers produced crops for both local consumption and international markets. Merchants built fortunes exporting timber, tobacco, rice, and other goods. Colonists enjoyed rights that many people in Europe did not have. They had elected assemblies, local courts, a tradition of self-government. For decades, Britain had allowed the colonies considerable freedom to manage their own affairs. This arrangement worked well for both sides. Britain benefited from colonial trade and resources, and the colonies benefited from the protection of the British Empire. The Royal Navy protected shipping routes. British armies defended colonial borders. When war broke out between Britain and France during the 7 Years' War in the 1750s, many colonists fought proudly alongside British soldiers. They saw themselves as loyal subjects of the king, not rebels, not revolutionaries, just Britons living across the Atlantic. But wars are expensive. And when the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, Britain faced a staggering problem: debt. The British government had borrowed enormous sums to fight the war, and now they needed revenue to repay it. To many officials in London, the solution seemed obvious. The American colonies had benefited from the war. Britain had defended them against French expansion. So it seemed only fair that the colonies should help pay for that protection. But what seemed fair in London felt very different in America. Taxation and tension. In 1765, Britain introduced the Stamp Act. It required colonists to purchase special stamped paper for legal documents, newspapers, and printed materials. At first glance, the tax was small, but the principle behind it sparked outrage. For the first time, Britain was directly taxing the colonies without their consent. Colonists argued that only their own elected assemblies had the authority to impose taxes. They had no representatives in Parliament. So they began to repeat a phrase that would soon echo across the colonies: no taxation without representation. Protests erupted. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods. Crowds gathered in colonial cities. Effigies of tax collectors were burned in the streets. Groups like the Sons of Liberty emerged to resist British policies. Some protests turned violent. Tax officials were harassed. Property was destroyed. The message was clear. The colonies would not quietly accept taxes imposed from across the ocean. Faced with growing unrest, Britain repealed the Stamp Act. But the conflict did not end, because the deeper issue remained unresolved. Who had the authority to govern the colonies? Britain believed Parliament had full sovereignty. The colonists believed they possessed the rights of Englishmen, including the right to consent to taxation. The disagreement was not yet about independence, it was about power, and neither side was willing to surrender it. The intolerable shift. In the years that followed, tensions continued to rise. New taxes were introduced through the Townshend Acts. British troops were stationed in colonial cities to maintain order. To many colonists, the presence of soldiers in their towns felt like occupation. The situation grew more explosive with the Quartering Act, which required colonists to house and supply British soldiers. Imagine foreign troops living in your city, walking your streets, entering your homes. For many colonists, it felt humiliating. Resentment grew. Arguments between soldiers and civilians became common. And in 1770, those tensions erupted into violence in the streets of Boston. A confrontation between British soldiers and a crowd of colonists escalated rapidly. Snowballs, stones, shouting. Then suddenly, gunfire. 5 colonists were killed. The event became known as the Boston Massacre. Colonial newspapers spread dramatic accounts of the incident. Engravings showed British soldiers firing mercilessly into helpless crowds. The story fueled anger across the colonies. Yet even after the Boston Massacre, most colonists still did not want independence. They wanted the violence to stop. They wanted Britain to respect colonial rights. They still hoped reconciliation was possible. And for a few years, tensions cooled, but peace would not last. Because in 1773, Britain made a decision that ignited one of the most famous acts of protest in history. The night that changed everything. Tea. It seems almost trivial now, but in the 18th century, tea was everywhere. Nearly every household drank it. And the British government decided to tax it. The Tea Act of 1773 gave the struggling British East India Company the right to sell tea directly in the colonies, while maintaining a small tax on the product. British officials believed the cheaper tea would actually please colonists. But many Americans saw the law as a trap. If they accepted the tea, they would be accepting Parliament's right to tax them. Resistance groups began organizing. Ships carrying British tea arrived in colonial ports. Most were turned away. But in Boston, tensions reached a boiling point. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists disguised themselves as Mohawk warriors. They boarded British ships in Boston Harbor, and one by one, they smashed open crates of tea and dumped them into the freezing water below. Over 300 chests of tea were destroyed, an act of defiance that shocked the British Empire. But the men involved did not call it a revolution. They called it a protest, a desperate attempt to be heard. In London, however, the reaction was swift and furious. Britain strikes back. The British government could not allow such defiance to go unanswered. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of harsh laws known in Britain as the Coercive Acts. In the colonies, they were called something else: the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was closed. Trade stopped. The Massachusetts government was placed under direct British control. Town meetings were restricted. British officials accused of crimes in the colonies could be sent to Britain for trial. To many colonists, this was punishment for demanding their rights. But something unexpected happened. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, the Intolerable Acts united the colonies. Communities from Georgia to New Hampshire began sending supplies to Boston. Colonial leaders gathered to discuss a coordinated response. In September 1774, representatives from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia. The gathering became known as the First Continental Congress. It was not a revolutionary government. Not yet. The delegates did not declare independence. Instead, they sent a petition to the king, a respectful appeal asking for colonial rights to be restored. Even at this moment, with soldiers stationed in cities, ports closed, and tensions rising, Many colonists still hoped peace could be restored, but events were already moving beyond their control. The road to war. As political debates continued, both sides quietly began preparing for something darker. Colonial militias started training. Weapons and gunpowder were stockpiled. Meanwhile, British commanders received orders to maintain control. In April 1775, British troops marched out of Boston toward the towns of Lexington and Concord. Their mission was simple: seize colonial weapons. But colonial writers carried warnings ahead of them. Among them was a silversmith named Paul Revere. Through the night, he rode across the countryside, alerting local militias. The British are coming. By the time British troops reached Lexington, armed colonists were waiting. Neither side truly wanted the first shot to be fired, but history often turns on moments no one fully controls. A gunshot rang out. No one knows who fired it. But the sound changed everything. The American Revolution had begun. Ending. Yet here is the strange truth about the beginning of America's war for independence. When the fighting started in 1775, the colonists still had not declared independence. Many still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. They believed the conflict could be resolved. They believed the king might still intervene on their behalf. But war has a way of transforming ideas. Once blood is shed, compromise becomes harder. Trust fades, and positions harden. Over the next year, events would push the colonies further down a path that could not be reversed. A path toward rebellion, toward independence, toward the birth of a new nation. But that outcome was far from certain. Because at the start of the American Revolution, almost no one believed the colonies could actually win. And in our next episode, we explore how a scattered group of farmers, merchants, and militia fighters challenged the most powerful empire on Earth and nearly lost everything trying. Subscribe to Hidden History FactVault.